So again, coming to us from Witwatersrand in Johannesburg is Brendon Billings. Dr. Billings is a biological anthropologist as well as an anatomy educator. He's the curator of collections within the School of Anatomical Sciences at Wits University, which hosts one of the largest collections in the world, the Dart collection. So Brendon, over to you.
Thanks. I'd firstly like to thank everyone for this opportunity to present. I've learned so much from the speakers concerning inclusivity, diversity, and so on. And my presentation is more of a personal journey with a specialized focus on body donation and our body donor program at the University of the Witwatersrand, or Wits University. I'd also like to mention that that some of the information that I'll be presenting, just listening to the other speakers, is of interest because I present in this talk information around our demographic profile that has changed with the establishment of our body donor program. And so I'm hoping that this will encourage some discussion around some of the limitations in terms of our representation of our cadavers within our dissection walls and the ethics that sometimes limits this representation. So just to give you some feedback on South Africa and our medical schools that we've got. So we've got about 14 medical schools spread across about 9 provinces within South Africa. 10 of these medical schools have a body donor program. Some are fully established, some are partial, and some are still in development. And these body donor programs are ideally governed by our legislation, namely the Human Tissue Act as well as the National Health Act. And this allows for the use of unclaimed remains. So legally, we are allowed to utilize unclaimed remains within our medical schools. But I find it surprising that we have 10 body donor programs. So this means to me that there is some ethical impetus amongst our faculty as well as staff to try and develop an ethical platform for acquiring bodies for teaching in medical education. So I will specifically focus on the University of the Witwatersrand, and Goran just demonstrated a beautiful image of one of our museums in his previous slide. So what do we have at the Wits University? On average, we've got about 80 cadavers per year. We share about 8 students share a cadaver during the section. And during the COVID pandemic, we were still able to maintain our numbers in terms of supply. And ideally, I think this was really just a result of our body donor program, which I think is quite successful in consideration of our past history. And so I just want to give a brief overview. I won't take too much of your time on the changing demographic profile of our body donor program. But I'd like to briefly just provide you with a history of our school. You'll note quite a few of the speakers are from the school. Goran was at Wits, Nalini was at Wits as well. And so in 2019, we celebrated our centenary. And so the school is over 100 years old. And within that 100 years, we've managed to successfully graduate 30,000 students. And during the inception of our school in 1919, we had our first dissection in a wood and iron shed. And this was most likely from a unclaimed individual. And the remains we used thereafter was from an unclaimed source as well. Our records indicate in 1946, this was when we had our first bequeathal. And if we fast forward to 2013, 2017, we conducted a study and identified that we had actually successfully transitioned from an unclaimed profile to a majority of 97% cadavers that were acquired via bequests and donations. So it took us approximately 100 years to get from unclaimed to a successfully transitioned body donor program where we are now acquiring cadavers ethically. And this is huge, especially in the context of Africa. This is quite an achievement that we've, and really a contribution from staff and faculty and their dedication. But I'd like to go into some of the changes around population affinity. And I'd like to just paint that in a social context, considering our history within South Africa. And this was also a personal journey for myself as a student of color, going through apartheid and developing as a student and now a member of faculty within the university. So the changes I'm describing here were really personal changes that affected me during my own development. I also have a keen interest in the history. So yeah, just entertain me for the next few minutes if you can. So in 1921 to 93, the majority of our cadavers were South African black males, and this was from an unclaimed source. In 1994, which was a very important and significant year for most South Africans, as apartheid had ended and we finally moved into a democratic society, we find that there is predominantly South African white individuals from a donor aspect. And as mentioned, in 2013 to 2017, we have an exclusively South African white population group within our dissection walls. And this is exclusively at the Wits University. And this really is because of our established body donor program. So we moved ideally from a South African black representation within our dissection walls to an exclusively white representation within our dissection walls. And why did this happen? This was against the background of our specific history. And I'd like to just give you a few notes on that. To those who don't know, South Africa struggled with apartheid for quite a few decades. And really apartheid was just limiting individual human rights. Certain individuals were allowed certain privileges and others based on their pigment were not. Some of the examples with its application to anatomy is, for example, the prohibition of individuals like myself, individuals of color, dissecting on European cadavers. But this extended into us not being able to practice medicine or attend university as well. However, our white colleagues during apartheid were privileged in the context that they had a majority black South African younger individuals represented within our dissection walls. But once again, this was from unclaimed remains. And so really what we had was a more diverse representation of cadavers, which was legal. As I mentioned, our specific acts allow for unclaimed remains to be utilized. But this was at the consequence of individual consent. And when we go over to post-apartheid, the establishment of our body donor program, we come to realize that we now have an exclusively white cadaver profile from donated remains within our dissection walls. So this I find quite interesting, and it's a reversal of sorts. So during apartheid, we had white male doctors predominantly getting their or receiving their education from the use of unclaimed black individuals. And in post-apartheid, we have majority black doctors being educated by an exclusively white individuals within our cadaver profile. So majority of the cadavers of white ancestry post-apartheid, but at the consequence of diversity. So we no longer have representation of individuals of color within our dissection walls post-apartheid. Is this a problem? I'm not sure. So if we look at the general population within South Africa, 81% of South Africans are of black African origin, and our dissection walls has a representation of 0.8% of these individuals. If we look at our white population within South Africa, 7.6% is represented in terms of the general population around whites. but our dissection walls had 98% of cadavers representing white individuals. In terms of other demographics, with the transition towards an established body donor program, we had a move from a younger population, as I mentioned earlier. These were predominantly black young males. And the reason why these individuals, just to give you some context to that, during apartheid, a lot of the black African males were migrated from the rural areas to Johannesburg to work in the mines. And these are individuals left their families at home, and many of them had pathologies associated to the mining environment, such as tuberculosis, and died within Johannesburg, but were not identified by their families. And so this allowed for a much younger population to be represented within our dissection walls. And as we started developing post-apartheid toward a established donor program, we find we have a much older population represented. In fact, a study we did in 2020, we identified that the majority of our cadavers are in the age range of about 71 to 90 years of age. If I look at the population statistics for Gauteng, the province we live in terms of the University of the Witwatersrand's location as well, individuals over 60 are only represented by 8.5% of the population. Again, my question is, do we have a clear representation in our dissection walls of our general population? And in addition to that, is that significant? In terms of the sex changes, I noted quite a few of you mentioned the male body, white male body, in terms of its representation. This is something that I also noted during my own development. In fact, it's been just a year ago since I've identified the first black individual in a textbook, an anatomy textbook. So this does have meaning for me, even though some may suggest that if you remove the skin, we're basically all the same, and the anatomy might be the same as well. But anyway, so in terms of the sex change, so we had a predominance of male individuals within our dissection walls. And now one of the positive changes with the established body donor program is that we're finding an equal male to female representation. So we have better representation of females within our dissection walls at present, which kind of matches what we're seeing within our greater population in terms of 51.1% of females being represented within the South African population. So this is really the crux of my talk today. With an established body donor program, there are associated trade-offs, specifically in the South African context at WITS. And I'd like to mention that body donor programs are important for ethical reasons, especially associated to informed consent. I understand this. It's quite significant. However, in our situation, it comes at the cost of diversity within the dissection walls. Why are we not seeing more representation of individuals of color within our dissection walls post-apartheid with the establishment of a body donor program? Well, there's a multitude of different reasons, and I'm sure many of you have similar issues within your own institutions. But within South Africa, culture and religion are two main factors that really limits the representation of these individuals from donating the remains. So we had predominantly older individuals, as mentioned to you, with the establishment of a body donor program. And I'm sure this would make sense to you, because with a body donor program, the individuals donating their remains, this usually happens at a much older age. People start thinking about this. And one of the more positive outcomes was we had better female representation. How does this affect our teaching and research, though? So if I look at the demographic profile of the WIT student body, this is a huge improvement post-apartheid. We have a representation of 75% black individuals and 25% white. So some of the interventions really helped and assisted. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for these interventions. But my question is, do we need a diverse representation of population groups within our dissection walls that reflects our general population? I don't know, but for me personally, I definitely think I do. I'd like to see my own within the dissection walls. I noted one of the speakers mentioning that the cadaver is really our first patient. And so to me, it's important and significant that we have this representation within our dissection walls. However, is it acceptable to use unclaimed remains to achieve this diversity? And that's really the conundrum that I'd like to pitch to you this evening. Do we follow an ethical platform with a lack of diversity? Or do we depend on unclaimed remains to ensure diversity? In terms of age, the cons around the donor program, obviously, senescence may affect the anatomical integrity of the tissue observed during dissection. But the pros of that is that you have overt pathology and a focus on gerontology. So we can always turn a negative into a positive. In terms of sex, female reproduction is significant for clinical teaching. I've learned quite a bit about the female representation from the talks this evening in terms of inclusivity. And so I'm very happy that at least with the establishment of our body donor program, we have better representation of females within our dissection walls. And to finish up, in conclusion, I'd like to encourage the establishment of body donor programs. I believe this is ethical, especially in Africa. I realize there's trade-offs that will present, but as mentioned, there's always ways to change the negatives into positives. And I also believe that diversity can be achieved through awareness. So even though we might not have that representation at present, I still believe every effort should be made to preserve the ethical practice of our body donor programs. Thank you so much.